myself. I don't join clubs, and I'm not a member of that club, and I never will be a member of that club.
Our friend Randall Carlson.
Randall is a Freemason, and I have spoken in Masonic lodges. I've been asked to give lectures, and I've happily done so. I'll give a lecture to anybody who's interested in hearing what I've got to say. And I've spoken several times in Masonic lodges. Through a mutual friend, I know an archaeologist who actually teaches at the University of Exeter in the UK, who's been involved in LiDAR work in Colombia, and they have identified what they're certain is an enormous pyramid in the middle of the Amazon rainforest.
Wow.
And the next step is to put a team out there and actually see it on the ground.
Well, that's cool. Are you going to go and check it out?
You bet I'm going to go if I get a chance.
I'd go with you.
Yeah.
Just let me know. Absolutely. And you wrote a book called The Sign and the Seal.
I did.
About the Ark of the Covenant.
Indeed so. And that was my first venture into what shall we call historical mystery. And in Ethiopia, I came across this really quite by chance. I found myself in the city of Aksum in Tigray in northern Ethiopia. And there were some strange processions going on and wonderful music and dancing and rituals being performed. And I asked, what's this all about? And they said, well, we have the Ark of the Covenant here. And these ceremonials are in honor of the Ark of the Covenant. And you've got the Ark of the Covenant here? I'd just seen Raiders of the Lost Ark. You've got the Ark of the Covenant here? Where? And they said, well, it's in that enclosure, and there's a huge religious enclosure in the heart of Aksum, which contains a 16th century church of St. Mary of Zion, and beside it a little chapel. And it's in that chapel that the Ethiopians claim the Ark is kept. And this is not a minor issue for Ethiopians. This is a very major issue for them. It's fundamental to Ethiopian culture. It's something that a lot of people don't understand. And it's kind of odd, because the Ark of the Covenant is a pre-Christian relic, and Ethiopia is largely a Christian country. Why is Ethiopian Christianity, which is very Old Testament in its form, very un-New Testament in its form, why is it, but still calling itself Christianity, why is it venerating a pre-Christian, non-Christian relic that belongs to Old Testament times? And so I began to do my own investigation, and my own investigation included a lot of time spent with the indigenous Ethiopian Jews. This is something, again, that's not widely known, but there has been, going back into remote prehistory, a Judaic community in Ethiopia, and in Ethiopia they're known as the Falashas. They refer to themselves as the Beta Israel, the House of Israel, and they say that their ancestors brought the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia, and it happened in this way. But first of all, their ancestors lived on an island in the Nile, and they lived there for some hundreds of years. Well, that's the first thing I checked. Was there ever a Jewish community on an island in the Nile? Yes, there was. On the island of Elephantine, opposite the modern city of Aswan in Upper Egypt, around 650 BC. The general story is that the Ark was stolen by the Babylonians about 60 years later, in 587 BC. But the Babylonians have no records of the Ark of the Covenant. They were ferocious bureaucrats, and they kept detailed records of everything they stole from the Temple of Jerusalem. It didn't include the Ark. The Ark, logically, was gone before the Babylonians ever got there. And suddenly the Falasha story of their ancestors living on an island in the Nile starts to make sense. And then I go in further into it, and I discover that around 400 BC, there was conflict between that Jewish community and the Egyptians. The conflict was because the island of Elephantine was dedicated to the god Khnum, and the Egyptian god Khnum is a ram-headed deity, and the Jewish community on that island were sacrificing rams. And again, this is historically established. They were thrown out. They were driven out. There's no evidence that they were massacred. They were just driven out of that island. And that's where it connects with the Falasha stories, that their ancestors were driven out of that island, and they then followed the Nile river system. They did not go north through a hostile Egypt. They went south. And the Nile, of course, divides into two branches, the Blue Nile and the White Nile. The White Nile rises in Uganda. The Blue Nile rises in Lake Tana in Ethiopia. And Lake Tana in Ethiopia is the center, the absolute center of the area in which the Ethiopian Jews live.
Wow.
And suddenly it all began to make sense.
Interesting.
You know, and could be stood up as a reasonable. I never saw the object that was called the Ark itself, and maybe that's just as well, because the guardians of the Ark get sick and die very, very rapidly.
Is it? Yeah, you said that. You said people come out with burns on their faces.
They typically get cataracts. They get blinded by cataracts, which is something that happens with radiation damage.
But your narrative of the Ark of the Covenant would preclude the Templars guarding it because they were later.
Well, no, it wouldn't actually.
Okay.
In this sense,
Okay.
that I came across a great Scottish traveller called James Bruce of Civenant.
Okay.
And James Bruce wrote a book in the 1780s or 90s called Travels to Discover the Source of the Nile. In which he claimed to have discovered the source of the Blue Nile in or near Lake Tana. What's puzzling about that is he already knew of a Portuguese priest who put that together 60 years before. And James Bruce had a powerful interest in the Ark of the Covenant and was present in Axum during the ceremony of Tinkat, when replicas of the Ark of the Covenant are brought out. And I began to get very interested in his story, and I became convinced, although I couldn't prove it, that he had been a Freemason, and that it was his Freemasonic interest that had taken him to Ethiopia. Let's not forget that James Bruce brought something back from Ethiopia. He brought back the Book of Enoch.
Wow.
We would not have the Book of Enoch, and it hadn't been for that Scottish traveller getting a copy of it written in the Ethiopian sacred language of Kings, and having it then translated.
That's
into
an
language.
ancient alien abduction story if I've ever heard of
Well, yeah,
it.
the Book of Enoch was a lost book
Yeah.
but it had been preserved in Ethiopia, and James Bruce found it and brought it back to Europe. I thought what could have motivated him, and could he have been a Freemason? And I began to look into this, and I couldn't find evidence for it. I went to his grave, which is in a little churchyard in Scotland near Falkirk, and I found that the grave was in a state of disrepair, but that the obelisk that had stood over the grave was lying on its side in the car park. And it was clear that something was going on. So I went to the keeper of the church and I asked him about this, and he said, "Oh yes, we're restoring the grave of James Bruce right now, and the obelisk will be re-erected there." And I said, "Who's funding this?" And he said, "Well, it's the Earl of Elgin." Oh, how interesting. Those were the days when you could pick up the phone and call an earl, and I did that in the probably 1990 when we were researching the Sign of the Seal. I called the Broomhill estate where the Earl of Elgin lives, and he answered the phone. And I said, "Look, this may seem very odd to you, but I'm a journalist, and I'm investigating the story of James Bruce of Kinnaird, and I understand you have an interest in him. Can I come and talk to you about him?" And he said gruffly, "I'll give you half an hour." He gave me 5 hours, and my wife Santa and I went to his place, his estate, and we sat down and talked to him. And at the end of it, rather nervously, I said, "Look, I've been working on this theory that James Bruce was a Freemason, and I can't stand it up. I can't prove it." He said, "My dear boy, of course he was a Freemason." And he gave me the lodge, the Kilwinning Lodge number 2 in Edinburgh, that James Bruce was a member of. And more than that, he was a speculative Freemason. He was interested in the esoteric side of Freemasonry. And so his journey to Ethiopia, I think, was very strongly connected to the Ark of the Covenant. Now we come to the Templars.
Yeah.
And the Templar connection with Freemasonry, and the fact that the speculation that I put in the Sign and the Seal that Templars had gone to Ethiopia in search of the Ark of the Covenant. There was a time when an Ethiopian prince, whose name was Lalibela, was an exile in Jerusalem, and that was during the Crusades, when the Templars held the whole Temple Mount. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was their palace. The Temple Mount was there at exactly the time that an Ethiopian prince exiled was present in Jerusalem. I speculated that he tipped the Templars off that the Ark of the Covenant was in Ethiopia. And weirdly, Lalibela then went back to Ethiopia with a strange force of people who installed him on the throne of Ethiopia, who sound like foreigners, not Ethiopians. And then he created these incredible churches, which are the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, one of which has a Templar cross painted on its ceiling, and an image of the Al-Aqsa Mosque with a cross on top of it, which only happened when the Templars were using it as their palace. So I began to see a possible connection here, that the Templars did have a long-term interest in the subject, that they had learnt some intelligence about it during their stay in Jerusalem, and that they'd followed that intelligence to Ethiopia and put Lalibela back on the throne and been involved in the construction of his amazing churches. All speculation,
Wow.
of course.
That's
But
fascinating.
interesting.
Speculation, but you've made a lot of pretty compelling connections.